Hello and welcome to a very special edition of the Host Planet podcast, which today comes from Your Air Success in London, our free event for the STR industry. Now, dynamic pricing is a must-have for every host and property manager, but not everyone knows how to optimize it correctly. Today, though, we're aiming to change that by talking to Shreeja Jamdar from PriceLabs. Shreeja is going to share 5 essential tips to optimize dynamic pricing, which will help hosts to boost their occupancy, revenue, and profits. Shreeja, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, James.
Real pleasure to have you on the show and to welcome you to Your Air Success. Okay, then straight into it. So give us tip number 1 to optimize your dynamic pricing.
Okay, so I want to talk about dynamic pricing for people that are using a dynamic pricing tool and for those that aren't. But like if you aren't, why aren't you? Right? So you should be. But if you aren't using a dynamic pricing tool, there's still so much that you can do by yourself and make sure that you're taking advantage of the benefits that dynamic pricing can bring you. And that tip is to basically understand your market, as simple as that. So you could do this by yourself. When I say you, a host could do this by themselves, or they could use a market research tool. Punch out there. PriceLabs has one. It's called Market Dashboards, but there's really a ton out there, right? So the number one thing is to just understand your market. What does seasonality look like in your market? What does the demand look like in your market, right? So which days does your market typically tend to see higher demands versus lower demands? Then you also want to look at any local events that are happening historically and coming up in the future, which may impact pricing, not just for you, but for your competitors as well. If you see that there's, I don't know, I know that there's the Ultra Music Festival that's coming up in Miami in the US, and I know that's going to push up rates quite a bit in Miami. So if you're not using a dynamic pricing tool and you know there's this festival coming on, you've got to increase your prices because everyone around you is, and that's a great opportunity to really maximize your revenue. And then you also want to look at what your market occupancy is looking like. What are the rates of your competitors looking like? Because that way you can also benchmark where you stand vis-a-vis your market. So if your occupancy is down compared to the market, you may want to drop your rates a little lower. Whereas if your occupancy is high as compared to the market, you can actually increase your prices a bit more. And I think the other thing that hosts can also look at is looking at their booking windows and what are the length of stay patterns that they see in their markets so they can determine when to really drop prices or increase prices depending on when they're most likely to get booked out, which is what the booking window is. And to then also think about how many nights they want they want a booking for, which is where the length of stay pattern comes in. Now, all of this, of course, gets handled in a much simpler and a more robust way when someone's using a dynamic pricing software. But of course, this is something that hosts can do for themselves if they're just sort of, dipping their toes in and they want to get a feel for something before they jump onto using a software. So yeah, I would say tip number 1, if you're not, or actually even if you are using a dynamic pricing software, understand your market, understand your competitors, and that's going to go a long way in anything and everything that you do for your pricing.
100%. Yeah. I mean, I remember when I started out and I wasn't using dynamic pricing at the start. And there's a music festival nearby where I live or where my rentals are. And loads of people were booking around that weekend and getting an amazing rate with my properties because I hadn't thought about putting the rate up because this festival was going on. And that's the thing with a dynamic pricing tool. It knows when demand is high and can put your rates up automatically, even if it's just like a wedding in the next village and you've got people which you're not going to know about because it's not like it's on other websites and stuff. So that's one of the key things that a dynamic pricing tool will help you achieve. Okay, then Shreeja, tip number 2.
So now let's move on to let's say you're on a dynamic pricing tool. So you've done your fair share of using research by yourself and you're like, hey, you know what, I want to get on a tool. Now, when you're starting to use a dynamic pricing tool, the most important thing, and it sounds absolutely basic, but it's really just the most fundamental building block of dynamic pricing, which is the base price. And to explain the base price, it's basically the price on top of which any premiums for high demand or any discounts for low demand will be applied. So the base price that a host gives to their dynamic pricing tool is what determines how their rates are going to look like for the rest of the year. Now, there are a couple of different ways to think about this base price. What we like to tell people is think about, and if they've gotten bookings previously, if this is not like, if they're not coming in super fresh into a dynamic pricing tool, and we'll talk about that. But if they've gotten some bookings previously, then think about the average rate that they got booked out and use that sort of like a proxy as your base price. But uh, one big point to note here is that if most of your bookings came in during your high period and you use that as your base price, then that is going to mean that your prices recommended by the dynamic pricing software are going to be slightly high, because one would expect that if you got most of your bookings in the high demand period, then your rate, your ADR is going to be slightly high. So what you want to do is, once you have inputted that base price into your dynamic pricing software, do have a look at the pricing recommendations for both the high seasons as well as the low seasons and see if that makes sense for you. Right? And this isn't a irreversible decision. So, and that's what we also encourage people to do. So, go and see if that base price makes sense. Let the software do its magic for a couple of weeks, and then you can go back in and readjust that base price. So if you're not getting any bookings, then maybe you want to drop your base price. And if you're getting too many bookings, then you maybe want to increase your base price. And the third thing I would say in setting a great base price is, at least on PriceLabs, we have this really nifty graph under the neighborhood data tab, which shows what your prices would look like, compared to the rest of the market. So when you put in your base price, go onto that graph and see how your prices are trending with respect to your market. You don't want to be priced way above, like let's say in the 95th percentile, or way below as well, unless of course your property is, an outlier itself, right? So unless your property is an outlier, you don't want to be priced way above or below the market. So that's what you want to do when you set your base price. And yeah, I think that's about it. Don't overthink it. Just be honest about what your property is, and uh, yeah, just go in there.
If you use a tool like PriceLabs, it
Yeah.
will assess your property and it will suggest the base price that you should be offering, or it'll give you like an estimate kind of thing. Is it important to kind of stick with what the recommendation is? If you go too high above that, are you really pricing yourself out of the market? How much attention should you pay to that suggested base price?
So the way I see it, right, I think the market recommended base price from PriceLabs is a great starting point because it takes into consideration your immediate market, listings like you that are more similar to you. So it takes all of that into consideration. But at the end of the day, there are going to be some aspects about your property that only you know about. um, for instance, and I love to quote this example for some reason, it's my favorite. uh, let's say a celebrity has stayed in your property, or this, I don't know, like super antique furniture, it's very one of a kind. You might want to increase your base price in that situation. So while it may be a two bed and it might be compared to another two beds around your, in your area, uh, a higher base price might be just what you need because that's what makes sense for your property. So, to sort of summarize, yes, I think the PriceLabs, base price is a fantastic starting point, but you should, as a host, consider that base price and think about what you're offering and if that makes sense as well.
Yeah, I mean, you're the manager and you're in control here,
Yeah.
even with the dynamic pricing tool. Brilliant. Okay, then tip number three.
So I think once you set your base price, the next thing you want to do is also set your minimum price. Now the minimum price is basically the lowest price that you'd accept for your listing. So you wouldn't want to accept a booking that's below, let's say, about £100, right? For instance, because it just does not make any operational sense. You're making a loss on it or whatever. Um, Now, one thing to note here is to also think of the minimum price, uh, is to also think about your low seasons. So don't just think about the minimum price with respect to your high season. So, for instance, if during your high season you'd get a £300, ADR, and then you'd think, hey, you know what, maybe my minimum price for my high season should be about £200. Don't go in with that as your minimum price, because maybe during your low season you might not get a booking for £200. Maybe you'd get a booking for, let's say, 120. So you want to keep your low season in mind as well when you're putting in your minimum price. A good rule of thumb that we like to sort of recommend is to have your minimum price set at about 70% of your base price. So if your base price is £100, your minimum price should be at least 70 or lower. What that also lets your dynamic pricing tool do is it lets you fluctuate. So what that means is if you set your minimum price to about 100, sorry, your base price to 100, and you set your minimum price to 90, there's not really too much room for your dynamic pricing tool to sort of wiggle your prices and really get you an right price for a low demand period, which will get you that booking. So you want to also leave some room, for your dynamic pricing software to fluctuate rates and find you the best rate for that night. Yeah.
Makes a lot of sense. Okay, then tip number 4.
So now that you've done all of this, I think this is all with the pricing aspect of it. But I think dynamic pricing and revenue management are as much about setting the right price as it's also about uh, optimizing your occupancy as well. And sure, setting the right price will optimize your occupancy, but the other ingredient to increasing your occupancy is also and your revenue is also setting the right minimum stays. And there's a bunch that you can do here, really. I think this is a topic for that can get its own podcast episode. But I think with respect to the top tips that I can sort of talk about here are a look at your market. What sort of minimum stays make sense? What I mean by that is if this is a market and also the time of the year. If this is if the time of the year and your market demand slightly higher minimum stays, then you want to make sure that you're also asking for longer night bookings. What I mean by that is, let's say most of your competitors are getting 5 night bookings, but you've set your minimum stay to about one night, then you're losing out on the opportunity to get in that guaranteed income of 5 nights by setting that one night booking, a one night minimum. So would recommend that you think about what your market is, what your market is doing. And the other two things are just about setting up a higher minimum stay for far out bookings. Um, Time is on your side here. If there's a booking that's coming in 3 to 4 months, I mean, whatever that far out looks like for your property, right? So time is on your side. So why not just get a uh, you know longer booking, and you hold on for that longer stay so you can maximize your revenue potential, because closer to the day you're anyway going to be getting in some of those last minute bookings, which brings me to my next point, which is your last minute minimum stay. Now, as your you know date approaches, uh, lowering your minimum stay allows you to capture those shorter bookings that sort of put lesser pressure on customers and on you to book out your property for only 5 nights or 3 nights. And so, when you have limited last minute demand, shorter bookings can secure some more guaranteed revenue for you. So, to sort of summarize that, look at your market, right? See what minimum stays make sense for your market. The second is to look at far out bookings and set a higher minimum stay, because you can guarantee a you know, uh, higher revenue and by holding out because time's on your side. And the third one is to lower your minimum stay for last minute bookings, because you want to make sure that you capture any booking that you can get in to fill out any gaps in the calendar.
Makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I mean, the last thing you want is somebody booking a one night stay 4 months ahead of time, and then that stops you from getting maybe a week long booking or a 2 week long booking. It can really affect your chances of getting those decent stays. Okay, then Shrija, fifth and final tip.
I think the fifth and final tip is to just reflect, which is to analyze your performance. You've done all of this. You've done the market research. You've thought about what your base price, your minimum price, and your minimum stay settings. But you want to make sure that you're doing this and getting the results that you want. So you should constantly, go back and look at how your performance is trending. Are you performing better or worse than last year? Um, you know, are you trending in the direction that you want to head in? How are you faring versus the market as well? Is there opportunity for you to do better, or are you right about there? So I'd say like the three things, the three sort of keystone, the holy trifecta of metrics for the short-term rental industry, which are occupancy, ADR, and RevPAR. Occupancy, of course, being the number of nights that you have booked upon the total number of available nights, gives you an idea of well how it's going to sound like a bit of a circular argument, but like how well your listing is trending with respect to the market. ADR is, of course, the average daily rate at which your property is getting booked at. And RevPAR is essentially your average daily rate into your occupancy. And so that's like one combined fundamental metric that gives you a snapshot into what your performance is really trending to. So there's a lot that you can unpack with these metrics, but I think that's something that people can do, by themselves later, because again, that can be another whole podcast episode. So yeah, I think just going in and really understanding what your performance, what your listings performance is looking like by looking at your occupancy, ADR, and RevPAR.
Perfect. All right, then. So we've got understand the market, set your base price right, get the minimum price right, make use of those minimum stays, and of course, track performance. All right, then,
Yeah.
Shrija, just tell us more about PriceLabs and where people can find out more information.
Okay, so PriceLabs is a revenue management software for the hospitality industry. We primarily service, short-term rentals, but we also service mid-term rentals and boutique hotels as well. And of course, if you have a camping, if you have a sort of a camping setup, that's also something that you can use PriceLabs for. Been around for about 10 years now. So there's a lot of amazing, rich data and insights that we have into, how short-term rental prices have been moving, year after year. So I really love that for us, which is our algorithm is, backed by this really, really strong data set, a very powerful algorithm. Um, you can find this at hello.pricelabs.co, and there's everything that you need on there. We have a 30-day free trial. So that's, again, something that I want to call out because you don't have to commit. You can always try the tool out. You don't need to add your card. You just need to add your listing. So give it a whirl if you want.
Fantastic. And we'll share a link with everybody at the show and in the show notes as well. Thank you so much for joining us at Your Air Success and, of course, on this very special edition of the Host Planet podcast.
Yes, thank you so much for having me here. And pumped to not be there at the event in person, but I'm sure it's going to be a great success. And we look forward to hearing all about it after.
All right, that's it for this very special edition of the Host Planet podcast, coming live from Your Air Success. My thanks to Shreeja for joining us. I hope you found that useful. Don't forget, hostplanet.club is your space for a load of free education related to the STR sector. Head there to listen to our podcasts, download our suite of ebooks, and sign up for our newsletter. That's it for today's show. I'll speak to you soon.